Greater Vancouver home prices have come down. There are more choices for buyers, sellers are negotiating. And in many cases, buyers are paying less than they would have a couple years ago. So why does buying a home in Greater Vancouver still feel so unaffordable? Because falling home prices and affordable housing are not the same thing. And this is where I think a lot of the conversations about Greater Vancouver real estate gets oversimplified. People hear that prices are down and assume buyers should suddenly be rushing back into the market, but they are not. And when you look at what a buyer actually has to pay every month, not just the purchase price, it starts to make a lot of sense. So today I will break down why Greater Vancouver housing can become cheaper without actually become affordable. And more importantly, what buyers should be looking at right now. Let's start with the biggest misconception. When people talk about housing affordability, they usually talk about price. But buyers don't live with a purchase price every month. They live with a payment. Let's say a home that was worth $1.2 million has come down to $1.1 million. That's meaningful. You have just taken $100,000 off the price. But that doesn't necessarily mean the buyer suddenly feel $100,000 richer. They still need to come up with a down payment. They still need to be qualified for the mortgage, and they still need monthly payment. And they still have all the other costs associated with the home ownership. So when buyers tell me, Michael, prices have dropped, why does everything still feel expensive? That's why. The sticker price changed, the entire cost of ownership did not. This is where interest rates completely change the affordability equation. Think back when the mortgage rates were extremely low, a buyer could borrow a very large amount of money and still have a relatively manageable monthly payment. That's not longer the environment we are in right now. Even after rates have come down from the heights, borrowed money remains considerably more expensive than it was during the ultra low rate years. So imagine two buyers purchasing the exact property at two different points on the market. The second buyer may actually pay less for the home, but still have a higher monthly mortgage payment. That's the part that gets lost when someone says price has come down. Why are not buyers buying? Because buyers don't make their mortgage payment with the benchmark price, they make it with their monthly income. And that's why the next part is even more important. This is really the structural problem. Even after the market correction we have seen, Greater Vancouver home prices remain extremely high relative to what local household can earn. A $50,000 or even $100,000 price reduction sounds significant, and it is. But when you are starting with $1 million property, that reduction doesn't suddenly turn it into an affordable home for the average household. So that's why I think asking, has prices fallen, is actually the wrong question. A better question is, has my purchasing power improved? Because those two are completely different things. Your purchasing power depends on your income, your down payment, your debt, mortgage rates, and how much a lender is actually willing to lend you. And for many Greater Vancouver home buyers, that purchasing power is still constrained. There are another affordability issue that doesn't get talked about enough. Even if you can afford a monthly payment, can you actually get into the market? Because Greater Vancouver still has a very large down payment barrier. Take a buyer who has been saving for years, prices went up 5%, that's great. But what if they are trying to buy a $900,000 or $1 million property? You are still looking at a substantial amount of cash for down payment. And that's before legal fees, property transfer tax, moving expenses, and emergency reserve you should ideally still have after completion. This is particularly difficult for first-time home buyers. Someone may have enough income to carry a mortgage, but not enough accumulated capital to comfortably make the purchase. So affordability is not just, can I make the payment? It's also, can I afford to get through the front door? And then regarding to something I see buyers paying much more attention to now. The mortgage is not the only monthly expense. For condo or townhome, you may have strata fees. There are going to be property tax, home insurance, utilities, maintenance, and eventually repairs. I've had buyers look at two properties with similar prices and realize that the actual monthly cost of owning them is completely different. Maybe one building has significantly higher strata fees. Maybe one house needs a roof, windows, or drainage work. Maybe one property looks cheaper, but until you calculate what's actually going to cost you to own for the next 5 years. And I think buyers today are much more cautious of this than buyers were during the rapid rising market. When prices were going down quickly, people were afraid of missing out. And today, they are doing the math. And that brings us to something sellers really need to understand. Buyers are not necessarily refusing to buy, they are simply refusing to overpay for compromise. That's the big difference. A buyer today might have 5 similar properties. Why would they rush into one property that's overpriced? Why accept upward layout? Why overlook 30,000 renovation? Why ignore the high strata fee? Why take on a property that's simply been poorly maintained? Unless the price compensates the buyer for those issues. This is what's happening right now where inventory increase and urgency decrease. Buyers start comparing, and the more they compare, the more value matters. That's why you can still see a really good property attract strong interest while another property 5 minutes away sits on the market. The market is not treating every home equally. Now, here's an interesting question. If Greater Vancouver housing still is not affordable after prices have fallen, how far would prices actually have to drop before affordability dramatically improve? And this is where I would be very careful about anyone giving you one magic number, because affordability can improve in several different ways. Prices could fall, mortgage rate could fall, household income could rise, or some combination of all three could happen. And that's why waiting specifically for a 10, 20, or 30% correction is not really a complete strategy. Because imagine prices fall another 10%, but your borrowing costs could rise, or lending standard tighten, or the type of property you actually want doesn't fall by the same amount. You may technically have waited for lower prices without meaningfully improving your buying position. So instead of trying to predict one number, I think buyers should focus on something much more practical. The number buyers should actually watch, and that number is your comfortable monthly carrying cost. Not your maximum approval, your comfortable number. That's the big difference. Start with the monthly amount you can realistically afford without becoming house poor, then work backward. Monthly payments, property taxes, strata fees, if applicable, home insurance, utilities, and maintenance fees. And leave yourself a financial buffer. Once you know that number, you can determine what price range actually makes sense for you. That's much more useful than saying, I will buy in Greater Vancouver when the prices fall another 10%. Because nobody knows exactly where the bottom will be. I don't. Your bank does not, and the person confidently predicting a 40% crash on the internet does not either. What you can know is whether a particular property works for your finances today. So yes, Greater Vancouver home prices have softened, buyers have more negotiating power. And there are opportunities today that simply were not available during the hottest part of the market. But none of that automatically means Vancouver housing has become affordable, because affordability is not determined by one number. It's the relationship between price, income, interest rates, down payments, total cost of ownership. And until those numbers come back into better alignment, Greater Vancouver can absolutely have falling prices while still feeling incredibly expensive. For buyers, that means this is not necessarily the time to rush, but it also doesn't mean you should automatically sit on the sideline and wait for the crash. Know your number, be selective, negotiate aggressively when the property gives you the opportunity. And buy when the number makes sense for your situation, not because someone on the internet tells you that the market is going up or down. If you are considering buying in Greater Vancouver and you are trying to figure out what actually makes sense in this market, feel free to reach out. This is Michael Chou with eXp Realty. And if you want straightforward Greater Vancouver real estate analysis without hype, like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one, or simply, better call Mike.